All right, everybody. Thanks for having. I got Doug Bendt here of Bendt Enterprises. He's a single family portfolio expert doing deals all across the country. Here to talk to us about some of the advantages of single family rental portfolios. Doug, thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks, Joe. No problem.
Awesome. Give us a quick background so everybody knows a little bit about you.
Okay, I got into the single family arena back in 2013. I was working at Deutsche Bank, and they had just made their big loans to Blackstone, who had started to buy up thousands of houses and what later became Invitation Homes. And they're looking around. It was a brand new sector, so they needed some analysis and data to introduce the sector to investors and the bankers and the rating agencies, and there wasn't much around. So it's kind of exciting to be at the beginning of this new institutionalization of single family rentals, and uncover the data sources and help educate people.
Wow, that sounds exciting, because that sector of the market has exploded of late. So that's got to be exciting. You get in there on the ground, like right when it was getting started.
Yes, no, it was true. It's been a sector a lot of people didn't appreciate how long and how many single family rental houses there were. I mean, it's always like millions and millions of single family houses. But what I quickly learned, that the average number of houses owned by an investor in single family rentals is less than 2. It's about 1.5. So it's like literally 80% of the people only own 1 or 2 houses. And so it's very disaggregated, very hard to get information on the sector. And that's still one of the challenges even now, 7 years later.
Usually what I find is in things like that, that also creates the opportunities in it.
It can, illiquid markets and wide bid-ask spreads are often good, but you have to get to the point where you get the seller and the buyer to agree on the price. So that's where liquidity comes into play, and having someone like Deutsche Bank or Blackstone, who's got vast pools of capital, access to vast pools of capital, can really big advantage in helping make those deals happen.
When you're looking at portfolios across the country, what are you looking for specifically? Are you looking with a specific buyer in mind, or do you look for sellers who are looking to market their properties and then take that out to a pool, or how do you work?
I started with the working with sellers. I thought, okay, it's, my wife's a real estate agent here in New York, and she always wants to get the listing, because then, if you've got the listing, you kind of control what's happening. Buyers can come and you're kind of assured of getting a commission. But in the bulk business and single family rentals, it's really knowing who the buyer is and finding the buyers that's more important. Because when you're a seller, if you've got, just an example, start with somebody relatively small, somebody who's got 5 or 10 homes, they've got some decent options. They can wait till the properties become vacant and sell them off to owner occupants. But you get a bigger portfolio, since you get to say 25 houses, you might have to wait a long time if you want to liquidate your whole portfolio, if you wait for them to become vacant. And so then the notion of selling them as a portfolio or in bulk becomes more attractive. But 25 houses, depending on the market, that could be, $4, $5, $6 million. And the number of people who have that kind of money just sort of, lying around uninvested is relatively small. And the bigger that the size of the portfolio is, the fewer the potential buyers are. So it's really getting hold of the buyers and knowing what areas they want to invest in, what kinds of properties, age, size, locations, etc.
That sounds very similar to apartment building buyers looking across the country, looking at different portfolios. So if you're talking to a buyers, like what is the differentiators you say when you're talking to someone? I'm looking at apartment buildings or I'm looking at single family rentals. What would you say are the differentiators?
You're right. The dollars are often about the same. You know, the apartments are usually a little cheaper on a per unit basis because there's a lot less land involved. But the things that are the differentiators are the kinds of tenants in each type of property. The property management, you know, obviously is different. And then who the investors might be and what the disposition strategy is. So if you have an apartment building, a traditional apartment building, say low rise out in a, you know, semi-suburban area, it might be 50 or 100 units. Some of the newer ones are much bigger. Well, first of all, there's longer time to build them if it's new construction, and then if it's existing construction, you have to sell the whole building. You can't just say, oh, I want to sell, you know, these 50 units and keep the other 50. That really doesn't work. So it does get a little bit of a different kind of investor in there in apartment building. They typically, you'll be there maybe for a longer period. There'll be less turnover, less liquidity, and less liquidity on maybe that side. But then on the tenant side, there's more turnover because typically those kind of apartments, if you get a second year out of a tenant, that's about average. The turnover rate's about 50% a year in those kind of buildings. But in single family rentals, they're bigger units. They typically get an older renter, often have children involved. And once they're again in school, people don't want to move every couple of years if they've got grade school kids. They'll probably be there for a good 5-6 years to basically they finish grade school. So the considerations of the turnover and ability to raise rents, maintenance issues, which are different. So there's on the operational side, there's some differences. Then on the investment side, though, that some of those differences actually work in favor for single family rentals because you've got that longer duration tenant. Hopefully they'll, if you've done a good job of screening them, they've got a fairly stable employment. COVID kind of interrupted that kind of story. I mean, there wasn't really all of us, a lot of people who thought they had stable employment didn't turn out to be so stable, and but leaving that for aside in very unusual circumstances. So you see greater stability in single family rentals. And because they are competitive with owner-occupied single family houses, there's a lot more velocity and price discovery, and the cycles are muted. So in the multifamily sector in the last 25 years, the price cycles are more dramatic, you know, steeper increases on the upside, but steeper declines as well. Where on the single family rentals, it's a little you know, steady. It still had some declines, but not nearly as much than on the apartment side.
As you're working with buyers who are looking to invest nationally in a portfolio, what are the requirements? I would imagine most of them are getting financing. Is that correct?
Yes, it depends on the size. You know, up to a lot of people. You know, if you're just starting out, you can go to Fannie Mae. You can buy up to 10 single family homes as rentals, and you know, for a single entity or borrower, and so that's very attractive financing. If you grow beyond that, then the next best thing is probably your local banks who have, you know, have commercial real estate divisions, and they know the areas, and they've got a good level of comfort, you know, lending into, you know, their local areas. And then if you can continue to grow it, you maybe run into some issues in terms of size. You know, maybe outgrowing the local bank, or they're going to really treat it as a commercial loan, and but still want personal guarantees, which get to be an issue. So non-recourse is generally more expensive. And there are some specialty lenders that have evolved in the last 5 to 10 years that concentrate on the single-family rental business. And there's a lot of apartment lenders as well. Arbor is the one that well-known in the multifamily sector. But they, about 2 years ago, they started a separate division inside the same company for lending to holders of single-family portfolios. So starting to see new entrants there as well.
I have noticed the exact same thing, that there's been so many entrants into lending into the single family rental bulk space over the last, it has really picked up, I would say, in the last 24 months, that I've been amazed.
Yeah, it's been very active, and some people went into it not having done a lot of their homework. There's a conference sponsoring company called Information Management Networks, and it's been 6 or 7 years now. They've sponsored 2 conferences a year on single family rentals, and they have a whole conference schedule for multifamilies as well. But the last one on single family rentals pre-COVID was like December 2019. And I think I counted 7 new exhibitors, 7 new lenders. And then there were some that hadn't even, didn't pay the exhibit fees and all. And some people you should have known better. I won't give out all the names to sort of protect the guilty, so to speak. But one was a woman who was working for a pretty big hedge fund, had private equity firm. And they said, well, they wanted to, get into the single family rentals, but they wanted their minimum loan size to be $100 million, because that's what it was on their commercial loans. And I said, well, you're going to have either a very easy time or a very hard time, because right now there's only a couple of dozen portfolios out there that, could want to borrow that much money. And she was just like kind of flabbergasted, but I said she should have known better. But aside from that kind of scale issue, there's a lot of some single family operators who actually own portfolios got into the business of lending to other people in the local area, sometimes with an eye toward being aggregators, that if one company I'm thinking of in particular, they had a portfolio of about 600 homes themselves. They're finding it hard to buy homes in the area. So they thought, well, maybe if we lend money to smaller people, we can end up buying some of the homes from them. So they're kind of seeing it as synergistic with their main part of the business, which is growing their own portfolio.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation about the lending. What kind of terms are out there in the market today for a buyer? Like if a buyer was looking at a portfolio of, say, $4 million worth of single family rentals, what kind of leverage and terms would they be looking at?
Probably at about 65, 70%, leverage. But the key component, I think, that's going to derive the rates will then be the amount of leverage, number one, and number two, what the debt service coverage ratio is going to be. Pretty much people looking for that to be a minimum of 1.3. So that's kind of a guideline to look for. Excuse me. And then, as I said before, even at $4 million, they may be looking at recourse. So if you definitely want a non-recourse building, you've got enough of a track record, you'll probably pay a little bit higher rate for that. Some of the companies, you can go to their websites and see that they post rates, or at least kind of indicative rates. CoreVest is one that has a lot of different programs available and different levels of leverage and all. Toorak, Toorak is another one. They don't do direct lending, but they're a correspondent. They've got about 50 correspondents, but they kind of set the terms for the borrowing. And then there's many in hard money lenders, so-called hard money lenders. If you're just starting out and maybe you're doing fix and flip loans, you're not sure if you want to hold them in portfolio. Those are going to come with higher rates. Those are going to be 8%, whereas like CoreVest, depending on size and scale, it's going to be somewhere probably around 5.5% compared to Fannie Mae. When it's still small, I mean now they're in the neighborhood of 3.5%. So it's kind of perverse in a way. Usually you think as you get bigger scale, you're going to get better terms, but because of the agency financing, there's that hump where it gets worse. And then you get to be the really big guys like Invitation Homes now, who or Progress Residential, who can do their own securitizations, where they take hundreds or maybe say some cases even thousands of loans, pool them together, or properties rather, and pool the cash flows together. Their all-in borrowing rates are going to be under 2.5%. So you get that kind of like curve, very low when you're small, and then very low when you're very large in between. And that kind of drives the behavior of where people invest and what kind of properties they can borrow. So like Invitation Homes, they're focusing on newer homes and more expensive homes, higher rents, higher income tenant profiles. But they're looking at cap rates under 5% because of the cheap borrowing, they can still make decent returns on that. But if your borrowing cost is 5.5%, well then, to have leverage help you, you've got to invest in properties that have higher cap rates. And those are typically in smaller towns, less expensive homes. Maybe they're not as good as neighborhoods. And that's really kind of what you see in the profile of who owns investment properties. You see that. And then at the very small borrowing people just starting out investing, they typically buy homes near where they live. About 75% buy their first investment property within 10 miles of where they live. They also can, they can be there to make the repairs themselves because they don't have the scale and all that. That's just like one of those little interesting factoids of the single family rental business.
When you're looking at the portfolios, is there a big distinction? Because I would imagine some of the portfolios, it's very condensed properties where they're very closely geographic, whether they're contiguous properties on one block or one neighborhood, or they're a little bit more scattered geographically, where there may be over a 10-mile radius from east to west and north to south because of how they were purchased over time. And then what kind of differences that makes for a buyer when what they're willing to pay and how they're going to manage it and what kind of lending is available for those two distinctions.
Yeah, so you're right. In terms of the scattered site ownership, does make a big difference on how close they are, and depends on the size of the portfolio too. But it's going to be easier to service, do the property management, especially if you're doing it yourself, if they're really tightly clustered. When you get a little bit bigger and then you've got a handyman on scale, then you can, on salary rather, then you can, it's a little easier to go out, a little further radius. Some of looking at the bigger portfolios, they do tend to sort of concentrate themselves and to take account of those efficiencies a little bit more. I remember doing an overlay of American Homes for Rent portfolio and Invitation Homes in one city, and they were, I think it was pretty much just by accident. I don't think they really, because they were buying houses, in 2012, 2013, 2014 at the same time, but they really kind of clustered themselves and they didn't really compete with each other. So They're just like one was a little bit more on the northeast side, one was a little bit more on the northwest side. So there are that differences, and that could have probably came more from looking at the demographics in the school districts and just being a little bit differences in the target markets. So, and then when you're seeing in the build to rent, it's trying to look like a multifamily unit, even though it's single occupancies, like especially ones where they're townhouse developments. They're going to be typically individually platted, individually titled. So maybe down the road, that gives you some flexibility in terms of selling off units that you don't have in a multifamily development. But it looks like that density can be almost as high. Project I'm working on in Colorado Springs, there's 13 units per acre. So it's a pretty dense project. There are 4 units per building, and there's little space in each building. There's about 40 some buildings. So that helps the economics a little bit better. Then you can get to the point where you may pay to actually have handyman on staff.
And then how, like, do you look at bulk condos, or is it just either individual, like bulk condominiums, where somebody owns 100 condominiums out of a 400 unit project?
I haven't seen too many of those yet. I know for what, during the building cycles there tend to generate that, especially if it's in like Miami, which is now like a second cycle where they, the builders get a little over exuberant and they're longer build cycles, and they get out of sync with interest rates and the economics. So that can happen. But no, it's dealt with a little bit differently. I think it's a different channels for selling. Like in New York here, Corcoran is one of the largest brokerage firms for selling individual units, but they have their own division for selling off new developments. So if there's any leftover units, they're going to be sold by that division instead. They're not really going to like hit the market. And a lot of the bigger investors also don't like buildings with HOAs or projects with HOAs. So condominiums definitely would have a homeowners association, and even portions, if it's a bigger project where an HOA is in place, probably shy away from that a little bit in terms of they could have changes in the rules affecting the length of tenancies and raising the dues, making returns a little bit less predictable. If you buy a whole project that was a build to rent, well, then there is kind of no HOA because you're in control of the whole project. So I think people are definitely looking for that kind of avenue to get into these build to rent projects or these bigger subdivisions that way, where they're basically taking the whole project and not having an HOA there.
When you're dealing with buyers for single family portfolios, what is it that they look for? Because I'm assuming management would be that's typically one of the tricky issues between multifamily and single family portfolios, because multifamily, obviously everything is proximity is incredibly easy. Whereas a portfolio, you're driving from one property to another to a different one. What do they look for in management, and how does that affect their decision?
So you're right. On the multifamily side, if the project is sufficiently large, say like 150 units or typically or more, may even have an on-site management person there and the support staff, some maintenance staff. And even if you own 150 houses in a relatively small, tight radius, though, there's no facility like that. So if one of those portfolios is getting looked to be sold, one of the most common things are that the management company, if the seller was self-managing or had a sort of captive management company, They look for a transition period, say up to a year, where the seller would continue to manage the houses themselves, and then look for a replacement company. Depending on the area of the country, there are some now larger, well, in some cases franchise, but property management firms that are with locations in multiple MSAs. Progress Residential is one that was self-managing their own portfolio for the private hedge fund that has about 40,000 units. So they decided to take advantage of the scale. So if it's in one of their 20 or so areas, they have a division now that will do property management for others, so managing for others. There's Renters Warehouse, which operates about 20 cities. And a lot of areas of the country will have a kind of a dominant local company. Colorado Springs, for example, that townhouse project, even though it's single family rentals, technically, it's going to be managed by an apartment management company out there who manages thousands of apartment units, because it looks like an apartment complex. It's all the density in a single location. So that would be harder to get a manager if those 160 are all scattered away, scattered site.
And when somebody's looking at purchasing a portfolio, what is the typical, say, due diligence they do or underwriting they do ahead of time before they make the offer? Once it goes under contract, what kind of due diligence periods, what are they going to do, financing, and then closing, both time frames and actions that are, let's say the right kind of buyer would do?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there's so much wanting to be done over the internet now. So many people start the search, whether it's buying a home to live in themselves or looking for portfolios. But the demands for information are similar, in the sense that physical inspection or the physical characteristics are crucial. But with a portfolio, especially if it's a remote buyer, that'll be a contingency clause that'll have 30 days after contract signing or signing an LOI to do that physical inspection. But ahead of time, we really want what the sellers have to be prepared to give to the prospective buyers are really good financials. Rent histories are key, and it can't just be like a paper bag full of rent receipts. Ideally, not even an Excel spreadsheet. Ideally, they'd be a customer of like Yardi or PropertyAware, one of the larger property management software companies. So they have some pretty good computerized records. Photos, certainly, for the marketing side, at the very minimum, exterior photos. If you could have interior photos, that would be better. So if somebody's thinking of selling a portfolio, like when the apartment turns, when there's a tenant turnover and it's vacant, get in there and take pictures, because once a tenant is there, then you don't necessarily want to disrupt the tenant to take your photos. So that's probably, good financial records, photographs, and then history of repairs. If there've been major renovations done for the system, especially the mechanical systems, like knowing when the air conditioning unit was replaced, when the roof was replaced, age of appliances, major appliances. All those really give the buyer a lot more comfort of not knowing, eliminating that process of not knowing how much money they're going to have to put in. Cosmetic things are pretty predictable, but mechanical systems aren't.
As you're going through that process, what percentage of buyers are getting financing typically?
That I don't know that there is a typical way to sell it. I think once you're up a little bit on the scale to larger ones, they'll buy them for cash and then put financing on later, because if you've got to have the lender re-underwrite every property before the transaction, that's going to make it really, really hard. There are some of the lenders like Corvest, you can get it's like an acquisition line. It's like more like a line of credit where there's agreed upon buy boxes of property criteria that are met. And as long as you buy properties that kind of meet those criteria, then they're, a little more comfortable not doing all that due diligence, up front. So it's still pretty customized. There's just not enough uniformity of a product.
I'm going through this with a small portfolio that we're in the process of brokering right now, and the appraisal process is a little different depending on the lenders. What is your experience with an appraisal process for lenders?
Well, that's a really good question, because that's the differences was part of what led me to try to work more with buyers than sellers. Because the seller, if their mindset is being a relatively small portfolio, if their mindset is selling them off one by one to owner occupants, they're going to look at each property on its own with like a BPO and appraisal, and view the portfolio price just adding up all those numbers. Whereas an investor, someone who's going to buy a prospective portfolio like that, they're going to look at how much rent each of those houses get, and what the expense profile is, what's the cap, what's the net operating income, and then kind of what kind of cap rate they're looking for to make that price and rent work to give them enough of a yield. And sometimes that leads to a pretty big gap in what sellers expect the properties are worth and what buyers want to pay. So that was really kind of like, as I said, led me to think about getting away from some of those issues, and especially with some of the smaller portfolios. It's like, if you have a 3 million portfolio, 300,000 makes a big difference. That's 10%. But if that's, say that might represent 15 or 20 houses, so it's really not that much per house, but in an aggregate comes out to a lot. Whereas if you're dealing with like a $30 million portfolio, it's unlikely you're really going to be off by 10%. That'd be $3 million. So it's a little, the gaps are easier to close on the bigger portfolios. Another way of looking at it, to have a background in economics, and there's a kind of a lot of people have heard Parkinson's law. They had several laws, but he was an old-time English economist. And one of his laws was, work always takes longer than you expect. But he had this one that, and this is, I said, back in the early part of the 20th century, he phrased it in terms of governments and government spending in the military. And everybody kind of knows how much a hammer should cost. So I don't know if you remember stories that came out, it's quite some time ago, I think when Reagan was president, that the Pentagon's Army was spending $400 for a hammer, and how outrageous that was, because people, hammer, I can go, blah, blah, blah. But no, the military's got to be titanium, and it's got to be precise. Anyhow, but the Air Force could go buy a jet airplane, it could be like 50 million bucks a piece, and nobody's going to question that, because who the heck knows how much a jet airplane should cost? So in Manhattan, you get a buyer who's maybe paying, $300,000 for a studio. They're going to look at what the faucets are, the brand of the faucets, the brand of the appliance, and really kind of scrutinize every dollar, but yet there's new construction, some of these, what they call billionaires rows and these really expensive high rises, like Sting sold an apartment for $50 million and he bought one 3 blocks away in a new building for $60 million. Well, how the heck do you know whether that apartment is worth 50 million or 60 million? You can't. And so that's some of that same thing a little bit in trying to price portfolios.
You're using the art and the science together.
Yeah, exactly. And it's especially if somebody hasn't done it before, like there are a lot of builders now that are new to build to rent. So they need to get educated in terms of a different level of finishes. You don't necessarily want to put in the highest grade appliances or the highest grade faucets because the tenants aren't going to appreciate them, and therefore the buyers, potential buyers, aren't going to pay up for that. Just if you sort of, that's one version of like over improving the property. You don't make it stand out. Don't be the best house on the block. I think it's a version of that.
When you're dealing with buyers across the country, I assume what other assets are they looking at, or asset classes are they looking at or invest in?
So a lot of them will own real estate of multiple kinds. One of probably the most popular kind of assets, because there's a lot of them around, are these small shopping centers or strip centers. Some may have an anchor tenant like a grocery store, drugstore. Some may just be a collection of 8 or 10 smaller stores. But that's a pretty common real estate asset for people to have. And then they'll own some houses as well. In terms of multifamilies, I know a lot of your people you work with are multifamily. There's sort of an orphan class, I guess, if you will. A lot of individual or smaller owners can own apartment buildings up to 20 units. Then that's getting to be, maybe $2 or $3 million. That may be about all person can afford on their own without really scaling up and all and making it a full-time job as opposed to sort of more passive investment. So, and then the bigger investors, like the big REITs or sort of professional investors, really don't want to buy apartment buildings with less than 100. So that 20 to 100 or 20 to 50 for sure, there's not necessarily a natural buyers for that. So then maybe you have to do like local syndications, you get a few people together to buy that. That really hasn't occurred on the single family side yet. There aren't not that infrastructure of accountants or lawyers who, on a local level would do those kind of syndications for smaller commercial deals, in other kinds of real estate.
That syndications, buyers, particularly syndicated buyers right now, is very popular in multifamily. Are you seeing that quite a bit in the single family space?
No, because it's, I think, again, because it's newer, people don't even know who else has a lot of properties. So you can get that information if you go to the tax assessor's office. They'll list every property in single family and who the owner is, but they don't have an index for you to say, oh, Joe Smith, he may own 20 properties, but it's just going to be 20 individual addresses with his name there, and it'd be really hard to try to search through the whole database. Or some areas have good online databases. You can download data sets, and if you're pretty adept with Excel, you could do the sorting and kind of make those, identify those portfolios. But that's a lot of work when people, don't necessarily have the skills and the time or know how to do that. So that's a gap in the information that's a little harder to bridge. No one's really really done that yet.
When you're dealing with buyers nationwide, how are you advising them or helping them when it comes to geographic location? Because there's a huge difference across the country in buying a portfolio of single family homes in California, in Los Angeles, versus the middle of Arkansas.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good one. So there is Roofstock is one of the companies out there that is acting as a kind of a brokerage firm for rental properties, and they list individual houses that are tenanted for sale, and they would have some listings for portfolios. And you're right, they have some rating systems. They take advantage of school data and some other metrics to kind of like grade neighborhoods. But an investor just looking at their site would say, okay, well, here's a property in Memphis, Tennessee, I can buy for $100,000. It's going to rent for $1,000 a month. And then they go to, let's say, Indianapolis, not that far away. There, that $100,000 property only rents for $800 a month. So you think, oh, well, I'll just, go to Memphis because, the return's better. But, Memphis isn't as big a city. It doesn't have, the income distribution is lower. So that $1,000 is in a different price tier, grade tier. And so rating, evaluating investments in different areas is really hard right now. Once you get a little bit more experience, like you have people who say they had experience in multifamily, whether it's in just their local area or maybe in another area, then they've got some benchmarking or evaluations they can do to know what yield differentials should be to take account of that risk. There's a good piece of data published on the Dallas-Fort Worth market by Graystar, big in the multifamily sector, where they showed rents and vacancy rates by age of the property, when the year built of the house was. And I was, it kind of fit with my priors, older properties rented for less and their vacancy rates tended to be a little bit higher, especially because of where COVID was hitting over the last year, more on the service industries and lower income. But I was really surprised at how stark the differential was. It was really, almost linear. So that's another way to maybe help get that, gauge what a proper return is. But then to go to another city, that tiering will still be there. But again, like then what I gave an example of Memphis, it's going to be just shifted down. And so you need to make that adjustment. And that kind of data is, again, it's all out there from the census and other places, but nobody's doing right now that evaluation. So that's part of the need for someone like me or some of the bigger consulting firms like John Burns for the big builders, where they've aggregated that data. John Burns charges though anywhere from several hundred to several $1,000s for their market studies or subscriptions. So that may be more than a small investor wants to spend, but they probably should spend a little bit before they go on. And that's why I think so many people invest close to home, because they've got a good sense of what the local area is doing.
So when you're dealing with buyers and they come to you and they say, Doug, I'm looking to buy a portfolio, what kind of qualifications do you put them through to make sure that they're ready, legitimate, and can execute on a transaction?
So for the most part, I've been dealing with either companies that have been in business for a while. I mean, and for a while is not, the whole industry is, at least from the institutional side, is only, 7 years. So it's not that long. But then there's looking at some of the newer entrants. They may not have been in the single family business, but they've been in the home building business, for example. And they decide, well, if I'm instead of just building homes for others, I'll maybe build them for myself and hold them. I'll get investors and they form their own investment company. Or one fellow who was a very efficient turnkey operator, meaning he was a builder, developer and builder. For the past 10 years, he built and sold 1,000 homes, but he sold them to 1,000 different investors. And so, and then he had 1,000 closings with different lawyers 1,000 times. He went through carpet selections and that whole thing. So he was kind of like, thrilled with the idea of going to like some bulk transactions. So there's a lot of different levels of experience. I haven't worked with anybody who just wanted to jump in and didn't have experience and say, hey, I want to go out and buy 25 houses. There may be some people out there doing that, but I think they're probably doing that on their own. They're not searching on LinkedIn to find me or other people like me.
And what any parting thoughts that you would like to leave the audience with? So if they're think of you, what would you like them to be thinking about?
So I think it's your audience is really two things. Well, maybe three. Let me not enumerate them in advance. But so first, if somebody owns a significant number of apartments, 50 or 100 or more, then it's given the name of your company there. Consider buying some single-family homes as well, because of think of it in those terms like product extension. If you've got an apartment building, like we talked about turnover, you're churning your tenants every 2 years. Well, some of them are probably going to go out and rent townhouses, or they're going to rent a single family house. If you had some single family houses or some townhouses as well, assuming they had a good experience with each other, they paid the rent on time and you were a good landlord and did repairs, then if you had that other kind of product, you could keep them as a tenant and maybe be a little more efficient and cut down on your advertising costs and vacancies and just have a better housing experience and build a little diversification. Some of the bigger companies are doing that, like Lennar at the very very large scale. They're building apartment buildings now as well as single family homes, and they're doing the build to rent. So I think that would be a good strategy to think about.
And what's the best way for people to get in touch with you? What's your preferred methods of contact across the spectrum?
Well, if they want to look up more about my background, which a lot of people do, I am on LinkedIn. Last name is Bendt. First name is Douglas, and I think I'm the only one on LinkedIn, although there is a namesake out in Nebraska. I discovered every once in a while we'll get a couple times we've gotten mail for each other of all things. I don't know how that happened, but and my email is really easy, just my full name @gmail.com. So that's the best way. Then the contact information and my phone number too is listed on my LinkedIn profile.
Awesome, Doug. Well, thanks for taking time to talk to us here over at 100 Units. I really appreciate sharing your insights on single family rentals.
Well, I enjoyed sharing them, Joe, and I just hope I get a few of your listeners interested in the idea, and they'll pursue it, whether with me or on their own, because it is a way that's going to be taking place for a lot of people of moving as we move forward, and home ownership's a little less common. Right now, interest rates are really low, but they're not going to stay low forever. So that's going to be good for rentals.
Awesome. Thanks, Doug. Have a great one.
Thanks.